Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third expanded Policy Brown Bag Series talk. My name is Jacob Kirksey. I am an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership Policy program in the College of Ed at Texas Tech. I am very happy to be hosting this series. If you haven't made it to one of our talks yet, I always like to remind people that the purpose of these talks is really to be this public-facing element between what our policy group in the College of Ed is doing, including our graduate students, with whom you're going to hear from today, actually, and the public. And so this video and the lecture and this discussion will be available, after today's talk, and I hope you will check out some of the other talks that we have scheduled for later in the semester. Before I get into the topic of today's conversation and turn it over to our wonderful speakers, I thought they all deserve their own introduction. So we have three speakers with us today, all of whom are PhD students in our Educational Leadership Policy program. Joseph Elefante is one of our speakers, and he is currently the supervisor of fine and performing arts, family and consumer science, and technology education for a mid-sized urban school district in northeastern New Jersey. His research interests primarily center on arts education and whole child education advocacy and holistic methods of measuring student success, teacher evaluations, and school quality. He is also interested in investigating the long-term outcomes of arts and non-cognitive skill development and developing methods of measuring quality arts and non-cognitive education in school settings. Christa Tucker, our second speaker, has also worked for 25 years in the field of education, with 14 of those years spent as a professional school counselor. During these years, she has encountered and established an interest in various dynamics that influence equity in accessing education, especially for students from marginalized subpopulations that are perennially underrepresented in higher education. This has ignited her interest in suitable policy and practice that can improve high school achievement among students of color. In particular, her research delves into factors influencing college readiness, college persistence, and eventual degree completion for students traditionally underrepresented in higher education. And last but not least, Levi Johnson is the director of the Texas Tech Center for Transformative Undergraduate Experiences. He holds a BA and MS degrees in mathematics and has has more than 10 years of experience connecting Texas pre-K through 12 schools with higher education through a range of STEM outreach and community engagement initiatives. He is passionate about leveraging the power of big data to make smarter and more impactful education policy. His research interests concerning education policies and decisions at the intersection between K-12 and higher education. We are very fortunate to have these three awesome graduate students with us who are going to be presenting their work that is united under this theme of faces in the classroom. They'll be digging into some empirical quantitative research that they've been working on, exploring various mechanisms related to familiarity, using data from a small California school district. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to our speakers. Actually, I need to unmute them because I forgot that I had done that. 1 second. There we go.
Hello, once again, my name is Christa Tucker, and thank you for your support and your attendance at our presentation, Faces in the Classroom, the impact of familiar and demographically representative peers and teachers on student attendance and academic outcomes. Wow, that was certainly a mouthful. But the goal of this presentation is to examine issues related to attendance, student familiarity, and demographic representation on students' academic and attendance outcomes. This presentation is centered on my co-presenters' collaborative research with Dr. Kirksey. And therefore, we would like to take this moment to give a shout out to Dr. K for his time, energy, and effort. Okay, next slide. Now let's kind of look at the word familiarity. As it relates to what we're looking at our research, we're looking at that relates to classmates. How familiar are your classmates? Familiar meaning face-to-face classmates from previous years. And that is very important for students to have that sense of belonging and connectiveness. As a school counselor, I reflect back on, I had a student that once he was struggling in one of his academic courses and really needed a schedule change. However, he was hesitant and decided not to do the schedule change because his thought was if it were to change his lunch, he did not want to have to walk into the lunchroom and not know anyone. So that is important. And in Dr. Kirksey's recent article, Familiar Faces, he also notes that when students know their peers, they do not have to adjust to make making new relationships, kind of like social disruption. Schooling is quite possible the most pervasive part of socialization for school age students. Much of the research of familiar faces involves experiments, looping, and keeping groups of students and teachers together over multiple years. As students, as engagement and achievement levels increase. There was a research in New York, the Deborah Mirror famously introduced looping in schools in 1970. And that concept has attempted to sparingly by some other private schools in allowing, in following decades. Among potential benefits of looping are increased instructional time, more comprehensive knowledge of the student's strengths, a level of social trust, and a stronger sense of community among students, teachers, and families. Next slide. And as we look at familiar faces, there are a couple of programs that have small learning communities that some of you may be familiar with. For example, AVID. AVID is a program that promotes small learning communities for students who are typically underrepresented on college campus. Now, AVID actually has a small community of learners that began from kindergarten and follow through that learning community, sometimes up into high school. And then we also have career academies, such as the Academies of Hampton. And the Academies of Hampton are another example of those small learning communities, which year after year, you have the familiar faces of career-focused small learning communities in which students will be prepared for success in career and life, as well as lifelong learners. And once again, we talked about looping in the classrooms, and then other programs that may have that familiar face pattern is establishing when students establish clubs and organizations, your early colleges and collegiate academy cohorts, as well as high school feeder patterns. Those are established so that students can have that continuity and familiar faces. Next slide. Now, our partner district is a California school district, and it is one of 37 states that use chronic absenteeism as an accountability indicator under ESSA. As we know, there are state and federal mandates such as ESSA School Quality and Student Success, in which districts through data-driven, evidence-based policy must address student absence or chronic absence. As we know, chronic absence are those that is defined by students missing about 10 or more days of school within one academic school year for any reason. And it's a powerful, that attendance, that chronic attendance is a powerful indicator, an early indicator of the prediction of student performance. Also, as discussed in Dr. K's Familiar Faces article, beyond test performance research has also documented the clear direction of students missing school and its consequences as it relates to grade retention, high school dropout, and unemployment. They are sharing very detailed data with us, and the school district, the California School District, has shared very detailed data with us. In return, we are giving them some analyzed data-informed responses to help guide policy development. Next slide. Now, we're going to, my co-presenter is going to talk about some of the policy context.
Hi, Christa. Thank you. I'm Joe Elefante, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming to our presentation today. So first, let's take a look at the policy context for why it's so important to look at absenteeism. Christa touched on some of this. First of all, the U.S. requires that all states report rates of chronic absenteeism to the Office of Civil Rights, which is then reported every 2 years as part of the Civil Rights Data Collection release. Also, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which is the Obama-era reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, requires that states choose at least one non-academic metric, or what they call a school quality or student success indicator, with which to measure school quality. So to date, 37 states and the District of Columbia have selected chronic absenteeism among their SQSS indicators. And many, many states have also included absenteeism as part of their state accountability systems. Particularly germane to our study is the California School Dashboard. It's an interactive website created to help parents and educators identify both strengths and areas of improvement for their school systems. They've included a K-8 chronic absentee indicator as part of that dashboard. Some other states, Connecticut includes a K-12 absenteeism in their state accountability system, part of which is a statewide goal to reduce absenteeism to 5% or lower. Indiana adds an indicator for students who have improved their attendance, and they include a reward system to schools for the amount of what they call model attendees. Most importantly, I think we want to stress that as absenteeism becomes more and more entrenched in state and district accountability frameworks, schools are really looking for malleable, relatively inexpensive ways to improve student engagement. Similar to ongoing work in schools to improve its student attendance rates, over the last 2 decades, we've seen a sharp increase in policymaker interest in K-12 STEM education. Despite significant attention, work, and resources, the United States continues to struggle to effectively train its STEM workforce. Particular to Levi's study are concerns that the United States is missing opportunities to address critical shortages by leaving valuable student talent behind. While minority student performance in K-12 has generally trended in a positive direction over the past 2 decades, there remains a persistent gap in representation at key gateways in the STEM academic pipeline. Upper-level high school math courses and college-level enrollment in STEM majors. In essence, if the students are being successfully supported to be in these key classrooms, or if they're not being supported, then we're denying them a legitimate opportunity to enter the STEM workforce. Federal and state level policymakers have employed a wide range of strategies in their work to improve this K-12 STEM pipeline. Some relevant examples of influential voices in this work are the 2010 President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the California Department of Education's calls for STEM improvement, and the massive increases in STEM-focused investments through ESSA. Clearly, we're still looking for effective ways to improve how schools are serving these needs. So what we're trying to see is if, using district administrative data, it is possible to identify factors that can improve student attendance and academic outcomes. because in these three studies, we have access to data at the classroom level, we're able to take a close look at factors like period by period attendance and peer and teacher demographic data. What Christa and I were looking at is something called familiar faces. This is an important term. I'm going to reference it a lot, as Christa already has. So familiar faces are current classmates that students have had in previous years. And what we want to know is, how do familiar faces affect student outcomes, or do they at all? And we have reason to believe that they do have an effect. There's research indicating that having stable peer relationships can have a positive effect on student sociability, leadership skills, and adjustment to school, especially in the transition to middle school, which is a particularly difficult age for adolescents. Those of you that have taught middle school like me, you'll recognize that to be true. We also have research showing that stable learning contexts, which can be enhanced by having consistent peer relationships, tend to improve student academic and social engagement, both of which can translate into improved attendance. Previous studies on familiar faces in elementary school have shown that a greater proportion of familiar faces corresponds to modest declines in both the number of days absent and chronic absenteeism, which is a huge issue. Continuing with our theme of leveraging different ideas of familiarity as classroom level policy levers, Levi's work is building on existing literature that provides preliminary evidence for a range of benefits when underrepresented minority students are taught by someone that could be described as demographically familiar. Underrepresented minority students taught by same-race teachers have found to perform better on tests, course grades, and behaviors. They've also been found to persist to attend college at increased rates. The Grissom study that directly points to racial representation enhancing future advanced math course enrollment is serving as an important pattern for Levi's project as well. And finally, the Chen et al. Study used national survey data to examine dimensions that Levi is using to extend the Grissom study to examine science data. It gives them an opportunity to examine whether these findings extend to our particular context and to ultimately offer our district partners recommendations related to their scheduling and staffing plans. So now I'm going to pass it to Levi to discuss our specific studies.
Hi, friends. So thanks, Joseph. I appreciate your setting that up. So I'm Levi, and before we jump into looking at some of the findings, I wanted to start by just walking you through each of our specific research questions. So under the familiar faces framework, Joe has been working on our first research question: is having more familiar faces in students' courses associated with fewer absences in high school, as well as in that specific course? And so that's that direct tie-in with the absenteeism and the ESSA piece that he already discussed. Then, so Christa builds on that and takes the same foundational data set, but then looks to see if having more familiar faces in students' courses actually is associated with improved academic outcomes. And so there we're looking at, do the students actually get better grades? Do they pass more of their classes when they have those familiar faces? So then the second thread that's kind of running through this then is the demographic representation discussion that I've been leading. And so there, my research question is, are student teacher demographic matches centered around race, ethnicity, and gender in gateway STEM courses associated with an increased likelihood of advanced STEM course enrollment? And so, for example, does a male Latinx student taking algebra taught by a male Latinx teacher make them any more or less likely to enroll in calculus before they graduate high school than if they took that algebra course taught by, say, an Asian female teacher? And so those three questions then kind of guide us as we move forward. Joe, do you mind going to the next slide? Awesome. So in service of these research questions, we've worked to leverage the administrative data that was shared by our partner district. And so these data included separate files outlining the student and teacher data that span over a 4-year period that began in the 2013-2014 school year. And so related to the students, we have basic demographic data, their period level attendance data, which is really cool. Their enrollment, so what courses and taught by what teachers, transcript data, so the course outcomes, discipline, and then achievement data for the years where tests were administered in California. Then for the teachers, we have their basic demographics, their classroom assignments that we use to tie back to the students, and then some basic information about their certification and their employment history. So most of the work has been invested in connecting those different data sets together so that we can then pursue those research questions. And a lot of it ends up being anchored then in views of the student pieces as they tie back to those other connections. And so this table gives you a quick preview of our kind of master data set. And so you'll notice that we were working from approximately 17,400 total observations that span that 4-year period. You'll notice that the district is predominantly Latinx, and that there's a significant percentage of English language learners and free reduced lunch students. And then also a relatively significant percentage of the student population are categorized as migrant students. You'll notice there on the right 2/3 of the data, you get a summary view of the breakdown of students with and without 50 or above and below that 50% threshold for familiar faces in their courses. And so that's just, again, a kind of overview of that piece. I'll give you just a second in case you wanted to peek over that. Oh, we're moving on. Thanks, Joseph. No, you're good, man. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the outcomes of interest for those 3 research questions. And so for Joseph's question, coming out of the familiar faces piece, looking specifically at those attendance outcomes, what he's examining is the percentage of days that students are absent from class overall. But then also we have enough detail in the data set to be able to break it out between excused and unexcused absences, which is really key in some of the work that we're doing there. Then second, we're looking at chronic absenteeism, truancy, and chronic truancy. And I had the pleasure of getting to work on some of that data in the fall on a class project around those pieces. And again, I know there's some really neat things that can be done on that piece. And so it's been exciting to watch Joe really run with that. Then, so Christa's taking the familiar faces angle, but then she's looking on the academic outcomes. And so specifically, we've got GPA out of the transcript data. We've got indications on whether students passed or failed individual courses. Then we also have A through G credit indicators. And for those of you like me that are new or unintroduced to some of the things in California, the A through G credits are specifically designated courses that are guaranteed to be considered in decisions about admission to Cal State and University of California system campuses. And so it's effectively a proxy indicator for things like college readiness, is the number of A through G credits that a student obtains. And then finally, Chris is also looking at the number of CTE credits, so career and technical education credits that students earn, and then tying that back to, again, that familiar faces framework. So then shifting to that other interpretation of the idea of what it means to be in a familiar context, I'm working with demographic representation and STEM enrollment. And so specifically what I'm looking at is, does your teacher and the demographics you do or do not share with them, does that inform subsequent decisions that students make about enrolling in upper division math and science courses in particular? Let's go to the next slide. So then let's zoom in on the treatment that the familiar faces team is using. So effectively, as was mentioned before, Christa and Joe in particular are looking at basically how consistent classmates year to year influence their outcomes. Specifically, what they looked at was the percentage of classmates in a given student's class that were in any class with that student in a previous year. So with the administrative data, we were able to look at that at the individual course level, which is really exciting, right? So we're not just talking about things that are aggregated on like an overall year cohort or by school cohort, but we can really zoom in and get into the detail level there. Ultimately, what we want to see is if the percentage of familiar faces has any effect on student absences, absent percentages. That includes their percentages of excused, unexcused absences, and the total absences. We also want to see the effect on chronic absenteeism. And in California, that's defined as the absence rate, having an absence rate of at least 10% truancy, which is missing a given course in a semester at least 3 times, and chronic truancy, which is missing a given course in a semester at least 10 times. Interestingly, where few previous studies in familiar faces look exclusively at elementary school, our team believes that we're the first to look at this at a high school level. And there's some similar complications on the demographic piece there as well. And then one last thing before I move on to treatment B. So it's also important to note that that same treatment is tied to Christa's outcomes, right? And so in addition to those absence pieces, we're looking at whether or not those familiar peers have an influence on the academic outcomes we discussed on the previous slide. Thanks, Joe. All right, so then for my treatment, mine's pretty straightforward, but it seems like every time I try to explain it gets a little complicated. We're looking at STEM gateway courses. And so where I'm at in the project right now is I've zoomed in on specifically Algebra 1. And those of you that have done work in K-12 STEM, you know that Algebra 1 is a key point in the road in determining a student's opportunity to access upper division classes, not just in math, but also in science and engineering curricula as well. So to define what we mean by a match, we look at each course that a student is enrolled, or when the student is in Algebra 1, rather. We examine their demographic breakdown that we have in the student data set, and we tie that back to the demographics from the teacher data set. And so a successful pair on these different dimensions would mean, for example, that you have a Latinx student taught by a Latinx Algebra 1 teacher. And so a non-match would be along, for instance, the gender dimension would be a female student taught by a male teacher. That would be a non-match. And so here we're using the idea of familiar to look at aligning along race, ethnicity, and gender dimensions. And just a quick note on the nature of the data set we inherited. Gender and sex are conflated into a single construct, and they're reported completely binary. And so we just have a male-female indicator for each entry. And then we worked from there. So then our foundational regression model is what we've got displayed on the screen there. And so the Y is our outcome that we're examining. And then where we have treat, that's the treatment effect. And then we've built in our controls there at X. And so it's important to note on the subscript, so math nerd for a second, I represents student, J is course, K is school, and T is year. And so this model allows us to investigate and then to implement fixed effects that we'll discuss on the next slide, the relationships there and look at them across while accounting for the differentiations in those different levels, student, course, school, and year. And I think let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. So here, the deltas that are associated with those 4 dimensions then represent in the model the fixed effects that we can account for. And so basically with fixed effects, what it allows us to do in the regression is to hold constant the variability that it would be attributed to one of those dimensions. And so for instance, in my work, to date, I've not implemented the individual student level fixed effects. And so I've been operating at more of the classroom level. And so if you were going to apply this model to the results that I'll be discussing here shortly, you would drop that delta I from the model there. So an example for just general, thinking about fixed effects, if we think about school level fixed effects, you could have a principal that is super focused on diverse hiring practices, very progressive in implementing programs and supports to make sure that underrepresented minority students are tracked into advanced STEM coursework and those kinds of things. And we don't have specific variables related to individual principals on those campuses. So what we can do is we can leverage school level fixed effects, and that can allow us to try to mitigate the potential overestimation of the impact of our treatment, right? So for using my project as an example, whether or not a Algebra 1 was taught by a demographically familiar teacher, we can use that school level fixed effects to account for what could be influenced by the principal instead. And it gives us a more reasonable estimate for what variability is being introduced into the situation by the actual treatments of interest. And so you can imagine all sorts of issues that could occur year to year between individual school campuses, or even between individual courses or students. And so this method allows us to analyze the data in such a way that we're responsibly accounting for some of those things that we can't control and hold constant as we move forward. So now what I'll do is I'll hand it off to Joseph, and he'll get to discuss the results of his part of the study.
Thanks, Levi. So as you can probably see, familiar faces did have a sizable effect on students' total absent rates. So specifically for overall absences, every 1% more familiar faces in a student's class correlated with a 0.045% drop in absence percentage. That may not seem like a whole lot at first glance, but it's a pretty interesting finding. Let me put that in context for you. So assume we increase the amount of familiar faces in a student's particular class by 10%, which isn't really that much if you think about it. Like for a class of 20 students, we're looking at adding 2 familiar faces. So that would correlate to almost a 0.5% drop in overall absences. Then if you increase the familiar face percentage by 20%, we're looking at nearly a full percentage point drop in absences. So given that over a quarter of the students in this study had an overall familiar faces percentage below 50%, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of room for this potential intervention. And it's interesting to note that the effect is much larger for unexcused than excused absences. So if you think about it, unexcused absences are more reflective of disengagement, right? These are students who are going out of their way to avoid class. And that's less true for excused absences. I mean, obviously, if students are home sick or at a doctor's appointment or something like that, we wouldn't expect familiar faces to have any effect on that. I mean, sure, on the margins, there may be some kids faking or exaggerating an illness to avoid class, but we're especially interested in that unexcused number. So it's really encouraging to see a 0.038% drop in unexcused absences in a given course for every additional percentage point of familiar faces in that course. It's also important to note that all these familiar faces results are statistically significant at a p-value below 0.001. And as a reminder, this model includes both student and unique course fixed effects. So we have the fixed effects for the individual student and the unique classroom that they're in for each course. So here we're looking at the effects on chronic absenteeism and truancy. And as you can see, there's virtually no effect of familiar faces on these outcomes. So although we noted that familiar faces do have an effect on absences, it does not appear to have been enough to affect these outcomes. It's also important to note that these results are not as statistically significant. For this model, we used student, school, grade level, and academic year fixed effects. So here's Christa again to discuss the results of her study.
Thank you, Joseph. Now, once again, we are looking at that data of GPA, academic course failures, AG credits, and as Levi described earlier, that those are your college readiness indicators for students that show that they have that potential to attend those California state institutions, as well as the CTE credits. But however, if you notice, there is not a positive or negative impact on familiar faces as it relates to GPA, course failures, or CTE courses. However, notice the positive relationship in familiar faces in those A through G credits. For every 1% of those familiar faces of students completing on average of 0.13 A through G credits, or in other words, for 100%, if we have 100% students were 100% had 100% of familiar faces, then they would complete about 1.3 additional A through G credits on average. which tells us that those students with familiar faces are completing those courses necessary to for those post-secondary attainment in those California state institutions. Next slide. I'll give it back to Levi.
Thanks, Christa. So looking at my results here, the table on the left is leveraging one of the exciting things about this administrative data that we've got. And that's that for the students, we've got race and ethnicity broken out as separate constructs in the data set. And so we have the luxury of actually looking at matching across those dimensions separately, not just aggregating them together. And so on the right, what you've got there is race and ethnicity are then conflated into a single construct, but then broken out across individual dimensions of race. And so the cool thing for us is we can look and see that just across the race construct in general, we have a significant positive relationship between the student and the teacher matching on race, and then the student's choice to subsequently enroll in an advanced math class in a later year. And so on that piece, we've got about a 3% increase in likelihood that the student chooses to enroll after having Algebra 1 with a race match teacher. So then we've got race and ethnicity match, which really starts to kind of feed into the next table there. But so in both, we see almost a 6% increase in likelihood of subsequent enrollment in an advanced math class if there's a race and ethnicity match in the Algebra 1 course. And then we do need to acknowledge that on gender, the initial analysis is showing a small negative relationship between a gender matched classroom and subsequent enrollment. And so that's something that we're very much interested in exploring further. And you'll see that it appears to kind of back off as we zoom in a little bit. So then looking at the second table, we've got a really interesting, significant relationship between Latinx students and Latinx teachers, an 8% increase in likelihood that they opt to take an advanced math course after Algebra 1. And then you'll notice that the male and female match, when broken out by a specific value on that variable, we no longer have a significant relationship there. And so that's something that we're looking at more. And I think I'm handing it back to Christa. Yes.
Thank you, Levi. Okay, now in summary, we believe that we have added to the growing body of research suggesting that yes, there are classroom specific, inexpensive, malleable factors that can be leveraged to improve student outcomes. Specifically, the percentage of familiar faces in students' classes, and can have a modestly positive impact or effect on students' absent rates, especially for unexcused absences, which is encouraging, so that it is a relative simple, low to no cost intervention that can be made at the school level. Familiar faces appear to have less effect on chronic absence and truancy. On the way to think about this is that effect on overall absences, although not insignificant, is not enough to affect those of more extreme outcomes. This makes sense if you think about it. First of all, these are students that are obviously tend to be more disengaged from school. Many of these students have absences rates way beyond the threshold where familiar faces could make a difference. For example, in our data set, over 12% of the students were missing at least 50% of their classes. Another way to think about this is that if I am one of those students that have these extremely high absent rates, familiar faces might mean less to me, because if I were barely in class, I don't even really know these students, despite the fact that they were in the class with me. Now, next slide. The research is telling us that scheduling matters for students' attendance and academic outcomes. It's obviously very difficult to make sure that all students have a certain percentage of familiar faces. With that being said, there are ways for districts to embed parameters within the process of assigning students to certain classes, teachers, or cohorts of students, closing and merging schools, or even redistricting school communities to include elements of familiarity. For example, CROSS has recommended an interior programming model for managing placement constraints in student scheduling. So that's potential to include familiar faces as a parameter in that kind of model. There's also a possibility of implementing looping programs, if even just for certain grade levels or categories of students.
Levi, did you want to add anything here about the last bit?
Yeah, sure. So just consistent with the kind of recommendations that seem to be emerging on the familiar faces dimension, there seems to be similar opportunities along this demographic matching. And I don't think anybody on our team is, well, I know Christa's not, insensitive to the plight of the folks in buildings that build schedules. The work of building a high school schedule is an incredibly complex and frustrating task. And so this is something that we understand we're contributing to a discussion about holistic strategies about trying to improve, maximize outcomes for students. But that being said, this demographic matching may be an opportunity not only on the scheduling piece, but then also on our hiring and recruiting strategies to account for particular demographics of students that a school may know that they need to do a better job of serving, and in particular in the STEM domain, then intentional recruitment into increasing the number of teachers that are represented across some of those dimensions is another strategy separate from just saying, go out and make sure you schedule it so that your existing teacher force aligns with this. And so that's the other implication there, is that some of these things for my project also inform discussions around recruitment, hiring, and retention practices. And so I think that just about wraps things up from our prepared set of stuff, but we'd love to talk if anyone's got any questions.
That was great. Thank you all. So I've taken down the setting. You can unmute yourself if you'd like and ask your question that way, or pop something in the chat, whatever suits you. But yeah, I would love to hear some questions you have for our speakers.
Okay, I'm working through this beast in the chat here. Be able to, I'm going to say a little bit more about excluding other factors that may or may not impact future enrollment in additional to demographic factors between teacher and student in math classes. Navigate factors like teachers' years of experience teaching math. So specifically related to teacher years of experience, that would be related to teacher level fixed effects, right? And whether those pieces impact students' future course enrollment more or less significantly than demographic measure. So right, so that's a legitimate concern, and so that's where the fixed effects give us a lever to pull in trying to mitigate those factors. And frankly, I need to go back and look at the results that we dropped in here, whether or not those included teacher fixed effects. But I know in the final outcome that's a plan to account for that there. Let me know if that doesn't address the question, but I think that does.
I have a question.
Is that Angela? I'm following
Yes.
yellow box on the street. What's up?
Hi. So after the study, what's the next step? Like, you have identified this. What's the next step? Will you recommend this to certain districts, or what's the next step to get more organizations to look at this information?
So since I'm already unmuted, I'll take a stab from my angle and then I'll kick it over to my compatriot. So for me, we're a long way off from making a formal recommendation back to the district. So like I mentioned, I've only gotten a chance to zoom in on the Algebra 1 gateway piece, and then only looking at that advanced math enrollment. And by the time we're done here, the plan is to have a comprehensive view at the interplay between those gateway courses and a range of STEM enrollment patterns. And so that's one piece, is that I want to have a better handle on what the data we have are telling us about their particular context and situation. Then the other piece, like I kind of hinted at, there's all sorts of other kind of policy limitations and concerns that we want to backfill into this discussion before we go back to the district and go, this is definitely what you need to do. Now, that being said, again, I think one of the most direct pathways for leveraging some of the stuff that we're working on is to think about opportunities like the recruitment and retention of diverse teaching faculty, which is its own ball of wax of problems, right? But that's a place where I think there's some opportunity. And before I go tell any counselor that she needs to change the way that she schedules classes, we want to be really sure that we're confident in what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Christa, did you want to take a stab, or Joe?
Well,
I think I would just pretty much reiterate what you said. I don't know that what we have here is conclusive enough to like necessarily be prepared to make a suggestion, but for example, I look at that integer programming model as something, in case we do find more research saying familiar faces has an effect in high school, I look at that as a way to really take sort of the pressure off of these counselors, because like Levi said, the last thing we want to do is start making their jobs any more difficult than they already are. I'm in district level administration myself, and someone just saying put more familiar faces in students' classes, that's a tough sell. But if we can come up with like an algorithm, basically like an automated way to do that, which that Krauss article does pretty well, then I think that might be something that could potentially make it easier and something that's more palatable to people that do master scheduling in schools.
And it brings in conversations with not only the school districts, but the companies that are establish and develop the software that the school districts use in order to schedule students and create master schedules as well, as you were referring to in the Krauss article.
Jennifer, addressing your question, no, I'm sorry, not Jennifer. Corbin, addressing your question about groups such as AVID and the outcomes in the specific area of focus. I'm not aware, maybe Christa is, or Levi, of any research by AVID specifically, but in the early part of the 21st century, there was a lot of research done on looping. And I'll say that the results were mixed, but pretty generally positive for both academic and student engagement outcomes on the looping research that's been done. In my research for this alone, I probably encountered 6 or 7 studies, all K through 12, of different looping interventions, and the results on student academic and attendance outcomes were generally very high, very good.
And I think what's beneficial, I'm sorry, with the AVID, again, is that smalling. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Wiseman, I'm sorry. It's that small learning community which helps those familiar faces, because the concept of AVID is for that cohort just to continue with each other in not only the same elective courses, but those academic courses as well, which are in alignment to those A through G courses.
I have a question if there's time. First of all, fantastic job. This is very interesting. I really enjoyed the presentation, the conceptualization, the results. Super excited. You guys deserve a lot of credit. And thanks to Dr. Kirksey for leading you down this path. And for those of you who are doc students in our program here at Texas Tech, you should be working with Dr. Kirksey. Look at this. Pretty impressive. So I have a couple of questions. I'll just throw them out there. You answer what you want to answer and tell me if I'm an idiot on the other ones. So I love the idea of familiar faces, and I wondered, because you didn't really address it exactly this way, does familiar faces count for teachers? Like if you have a teacher that teaches a grade for multiple years, would that count as a familiar face?
In my opinion, that would. And honestly, that is something that Dr. Kirksey and I have talked about doing in future work. We definitely want to examine the effect of both peer and teacher familiar faces. So that's definitely something that we're looking at in the future. That's a great question. Cool.
I also wondered, so you had familiar faces by race, ethnicity, and gender, but and if I missed it, I'm telling me, but I didn't see anything by socioeconomic status. And there's a lot of literature out there that shows that culture in particular is developed by this interplay between race, ethnicity, and SES. And so I wondered if that mattered. I mean, you could have a teacher who maybe comes from an elite background, but is teaching in a low-income community. Even if it's a race match, for example, would they still have difficulty making that connection? So I wondered about that. And then I also wondered if the type of interaction among the familiar faces matters. So if a kid's getting bullied by the same kids year after year, that's probably not going to have a very positive effect. So anyway, that's just something else conceptually. And then just on the analysis part, if I'm taking away policy lessons from, and Joe, I'm looking at your table in particular, whatever ref to juvenile court is, that's what I'd recommend. That lowers absenteeism by the greatest amount, right? That's a negative 19.186 compared to negative 0.04 or whatever. So you know what I mean? So I wonder how you would account for that when you're going to make recommendations back to the district. I'm joking about that, obviously, but also free and reduced lunch was negative 1.207. So we just give everybody free and reduced lunch. Would that work? You know what I mean? So it's something to think about. And
For sure. I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt. My take on the free and reduced lunch thing is very interesting. I know you're joking, but my take on the referred to juvenile court thing, I mean, obviously that's a really, really small student population. So I don't know that we could necessarily extrapolate that across I don't think we want to be referring students to juvenile court so that they miss fewer days of school necessarily.
I think that would be worth discussing, especially, and this is just me being picky, but if you're going to show all of that data, like I would be a little more specific about which parts of that outcome data I would show when you're sharing it, because you're right, it is obviously a silly suggestion, but if we're just looking at the numbers, that's the one that popped, because the first thing I did was I looked for the largest negative number in that table, and that was it. All right, last thing, Levi. Christa, yours apparently was perfect because I don't have any questions on yours. Levi.
I thought I was going to get away.
The only ethnicity that mattered was the Latinx one. Is that because Latinx is more than 50% of the population in the community? And I mean, how are you going to explain that? Because it doesn't matter any other ethnicity. Why is there something unique about that community?
Right. So there's definitely issues tied to the overrepresentation of that subpop, both in the teachers and the students. And then, like I said, I think the results that I was displaying tonight did not account for teacher fixed effects. And so that's one of the things that as we evolve this project and look at that more holistic STEM gateway pipeline piece, we've got to make sure that we're being sensitive to some of those things. I will say the demographics of the teacher population at the school remove opportunities for representation in some key so for instance, I don't think we have any African-American teachers in our data set at all. And so in some ways, it's just a limitation of, we're working with the data that we have there, and that Grissom piece that has been really informing a lot of my strategic moves here. They were working with Miami-Dade County, so they had a little bit bigger sample, and they had a more diverse teacher and student population. And so there's been some ongoing discussions about what we need to do to responsibly account for, like, in some sense, a lack of diversity compared to some of those other ones. And then last thing I'll say on that is what we're really excited about is we're trying to tune up a toolkit really that ultimately will translate to some projects that we're working on with the Texas Education Research Center. And there we're talking about data set that's massive and scales a whole bunch more years and the entire state of Texas. And so some of these issues start to take care of themselves when we move into that just higher quality data set.
Thank you all. Really well done.
Thank you all for coming.
So 5 minutes for questions if anyone wants to ask any.
Hi, I was going to ask a question. This is Jesse. I was curious if the data that you looked at provided any information on the circumstances that were preventing students from being present, such as like family responsibilities or dealing with food insecurity or transportation issues?
That's a great question, Jesse. No, we did not have access to any of that data, but that would obviously be informing our research to a great deal if we did.
So we do have some detail in the discipline data, right? There's some coding there that's not specific to like why they're absent, but we know when they hit different responses to disciplinary activity. That's the closest thing I can think of in the data set where we get a little bit of insight to what might be going on in the students' lives, other than like, were they present? You know, did they pass? What was their grade?
And we also, I think, have to keep in mind how ESSA looks at chronic absenteeism is 10 absences. I'm not sure if they want to specify, even though that would be good information to have as it relates to familiar faces and the outcomes.
Not to correct you, Christa, I think it's actually 10%.
Yes, percent. Yeah.
And so I guess we do have a little bit of demographic data that might give us some proxies for some of the challenges that they would be dealing with, right? So we have the migrant indicator, and we have free and reduced lunch, and then
homeless indicator.
Yeah, so I say that, but there may be some things in there. Now, some of that would be accounted for in the student level fixed effects, right? Like that would be a big piece to account for that in some of this analysis. And again, that didn't make its way into my results for tonight. But Joe, I think you did, right?
We did, yeah. We did look at the student level fixed effects for both absences and chronic absenteeism.
All right, well, unless anyone else has a last burning question, just huge kudos to our 3 speakers for this talk, all amazing PhD students in our Ed Leadership Policy program. I hope you all who came enjoyed. Their emails were on that slide. This recording will be available on the website where you registered, as well as our YouTube channel that I just learned to set up. So everyone's learning new stuff these days. Thank you again for coming. Our next talk will be in 1 second. Forgot to plug that. 3 weeks? Is that right? Oh, I can't see. Well, I guess you'll have to look on the website. But our next talk I'm really excited about. Check out our schedule. We have, I believe, 4 or 5 more talks coming up this semester, which I'm really excited about. So thank you again to our speakers. I hope you all enjoyed. Have a good one.